A rich family fired their old butler. Then they learned who he really was. Have you ever judged someone by their appearance, their job, or the way they quietly lived their life? Sometimes the people we overlook are carrying stories far greater than we could ever imagine. Today's story proves that respect should never depend on wealth or status. Stay until the very end, because this ending will completely change everything you thought you knew. And before we begin, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. The Hawthorne mansion stood on a hill overlooking the city, like a palace built for royalty. Every window sparkled. Every garden was perfectly trimmed. Expensive cars lined the circular driveway. And every weekend, the estate welcomed politicians, celebrities, and wealthy investors. People admired the Hawthorne family. They envied their fortune. But behind the elegant walls, kindness was something money had failed to buy. For 38 years, one man had served the Hawthorne family with complete loyalty. His name was Arthur Bennett. At 72 years old, Arthur moved more slowly than he once had. His silver hair was always neatly combed, and every morning he wore the same perfectly pressed black suit with polished shoes. He knew every room in the mansion, every painting, every secret passage, every family tradition. He had watched 3 generations of Hawthornes grow up. When little William Hawthorne scraped his knees learning to ride a bicycle, Arthur carried him inside. When young Charlotte Hawthorne cried after losing her mother, Arthur sat beside her for hours without saying a word, simply letting her know she wasn't alone. He remembered birthdays nobody else remembered. He watered Mrs. Hawthorne's favorite roses after she passed away. He even continued polishing Mr. Hawthorne Sr.'s old pocket watch every Sunday, although its owner had died almost 15 years earlier. Arthur wasn't just an employee. He was part of the house itself. Yet somehow, everyone had forgotten that, especially Richard Hawthorne. Richard had inherited the family empire after his father's death. Unlike his father, Richard measured people by one thing: profit. If something or someone didn't increase his wealth, he considered them useless. One Monday morning, Richard entered the dining room carrying a stack of financial reports. "This house costs too much to maintain," he said sharply. His wife Victoria barely looked up from her coffee. "So?" "We're cutting unnecessary expenses." Their son Ethan smirked. "Finally." Richard flipped another page. "We have gardeners, chefs, drivers." He stopped. "And an old butler who barely walks anymore." Arthur happened to be pouring tea nearby. His hands paused for just a second. Richard looked directly at him. "Arthur." "Yes, sir." "How old are you now?" 72. Richard nodded without emotion. "Exactly." Silence filled the room. "I think it's time for you to retire." Arthur remained perfectly still. "If that is your wish, sir." Richard leaned back. "You've had a long career. Be grateful. We'll give you 2 weeks' salary." Only 2 weeks. After nearly 4 decades. Charlotte, Richard's younger sister, lowered her newspaper. "Richard, don't you think that's a little harsh?" Richard shrugged. "This isn't charity." Arthur quietly placed the teapot on the table. "I understand." His calm voice somehow made everyone else uncomfortable. "Except Richard." "Good," Richard replied. "Please leave your keys before you go." Arthur simply nodded. Of course. News traveled quickly through the staff. The cook cried. The head gardener shook his head. Even the chauffeur, a man who rarely showed emotion, muttered, "This house won't be the same." Arthur smiled gently. Everything changes eventually. That afternoon, he packed his belongings. One small suitcase, a few books, an old fountain pen, several neatly folded photographs. Nothing more. 38 years, reduced to a single suitcase. As Arthur closed the door to his tiny room above the servants' quarters, he looked around one last time. He didn't seem angry, only disappointed. Not in losing his job, in seeing how much the family had changed. Before leaving, Arthur walked through the mansion one final time. He paused in front of every room. The library, the music hall, the grand staircase, the garden. Memories followed him like silent ghosts. Little Ethan hiding behind the curtains during games of hide and seek. Charlotte practicing piano until midnight. Mr. Hawthorne Sr. thanking Arthur after every Christmas dinner. Your family, Arthur. Those words echoed inside his mind. Family. How quickly people forget promises. As Arthur reached the front entrance, Charlotte hurried after him. Arthur, wait. She handed him a small envelope. I know this isn't enough. Arthur smiled. You've always had your mother's heart. Tears filled Charlotte's eyes. I'm so sorry. Arthur gently shook his head. Never apologize for someone else's choices. She hesitated. What will you do now? Arthur looked toward the horizon. I suppose, he smiled warmly, I'll finally take care of some unfinished business. Charlotte frowned. What business? Arthur simply tipped his hat. You'll understand someday. Then he walked away. No anger, no revenge, no dramatic speech. Just an old man disappearing down the long driveway where he had welcomed thousands of guests over nearly 4 decades. None of the Hawthornes noticed something unusual. Arthur never looked back. Not even once. 3 days later, strange things began happening. Richard's biggest investor suddenly canceled a $1 billion partnership. Another company withdrew from negotiations without explanation. 2 board members resigned. Then their bank requested an urgent meeting. Within 48 hours, the Hawthorne family found themselves facing the largest financial crisis in company history. Richard slammed his fist against his desk. This makes no sense. His chief financial officer looked nervous. We've lost confidence in the market. But why? No one knows. Richard became furious. Find out. Meanwhile, Charlotte couldn't stop thinking about Arthur's final words. You'll understand someday. For the first time in years, she wondered whether the quiet old butler had been hiding far more than anyone had ever imagined. And what she was about to discover would change the Hawthorne family forever. If you've enjoyed the story so far, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe. The biggest twist is still ahead, and trust me, you won't want to miss it. Charlotte couldn't stop thinking about Arthur. For 3 nights, she barely slept. The image of the old butler walking away with nothing but a small suitcase haunted her. It wasn't just guilt. It was the strange confidence in his voice when he had said, I'll finally take care of some unfinished business. Arthur hadn't sounded like a broken old man. He had sounded free. Meanwhile, chaos consumed Hawthorne Enterprises. Richard had never seen anything like it. One contract after another disappeared. Banks delayed credit approvals. Business partners who had been loyal for years suddenly refused to answer his calls. The company's stock began falling. Every hour brought worse news. Richard stormed into the executive conference room. "I want answers," he shouted. 20 executives sat silently around the polished table. No one spoke. Finally, the chief financial officer cleared his throat. "There is one unusual detail." Richard glared at him. "What?" "Several investors specifically asked whether Mr. Arthur Bennett still works for the Hawthorne family." The room fell silent. Richard laughed sarcastically. "Our butler?" "Yes." Richard rolled his eyes. "This is ridiculous." "No, sir." The CFO slid several emails across the table. Richard quickly skimmed through them. Each contained almost the same question. Is Arthur Bennett still associated with the Hawthorne family? One investor had even written, "Please confirm Mr. Bennett's current position before we proceed." Richard frowned. What kind of nonsense is this? No one will explain. Richard crumpled the papers. This has nothing to do with Arthur. He stood up. Continue looking. But for the first time, doubt entered his mind. That evening, Charlotte drove to a quiet neighborhood on the other side of the city. She had found Arthur's address in the old employee records. The house surprised her. It wasn't large, it wasn't luxurious, but every flower in the garden was blooming. The lawn was perfectly trimmed. Children laughed nearby. Arthur was kneeling beside a little girl, helping her plant roses. When he saw Charlotte, he smiled as though he had been expecting her. "Miss Charlotte." She smiled nervously. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Never." Arthur stood and brushed the dirt from his hands. "You've grown into your mother's kindness." Charlotte felt tears forming again. "I'm sorry." Arthur shook his head gently. "You've already apologized." "I still feel responsible." Arthur opened the gate. "Come inside." The house was filled with books, hundreds of them. History, economics, philosophy, law, politics. Charlotte blinked. "I never knew you loved reading." Arthur chuckled. "There are many things people never knew." She noticed framed photographs on the wall. Arthur standing beside world leaders. Arthur shaking hands with famous entrepreneurs. Arthur receiving an award from a president. Charlotte stared. "What?" Arthur quietly poured tea. "You have questions." She picked up one photograph. It showed Arthur standing beside Richard's late father, but they weren't dressed as employer and servant. They looked equal. What is all this? Arthur didn't answer immediately. Instead, he asked, "What do you know about your grandfather?" Charlotte frowned. "He built the Hawthorne fortune." Arthur smiled softly. "That's what everyone believes." "What do you mean?" Arthur looked out the window. Sometimes history remembers only one name. Before Arthur could continue, a black luxury sedan stopped outside. Another followed. Then another. Charlotte looked outside. Nearly 10 expensive vehicles lined the street. Men and women in elegant business suits stepped out. Arthur smiled. Right on time. Charlotte stared. Who are they? Arthur answered calmly. Old friends. One by one, the visitors entered. Charlotte recognized several faces immediately. The chairman of one of the world's largest investment funds, a famous technology billionaire, a retired senator, the owner of an international shipping empire. Every one of them greeted Arthur with genuine warmth. Arthur, my old friend, it's been too long. One elderly billionaire hugged Arthur tightly. You finally retired. Arthur laughed. It wasn't exactly my decision. The room filled with laughter. Charlotte couldn't believe what she was seeing. These were people who appeared on television, people whose companies were worth billions. Yet every one of them treated Arthur like family. One businessman noticed Charlotte. You must be one of the Hawthornes. She nodded. He smiled politely. Your grandfather spoke about Arthur every chance he got. My grandfather? Oh, yes. He used to say that without Arthur, there would never have been a Hawthorne empire. Charlotte felt her heart race. What do you mean? The businessman looked surprised. You don't know? Arthur quietly interrupted. Perhaps another time. But Charlotte refused. No. She looked directly at Arthur. I need to know. Arthur walked toward an old wooden cabinet. From its top shelf, he removed a worn leather box. Its edges were faded with age. The lock clicked open. Inside were letters, contracts, photographs, and one old newspaper from 40 years earlier. The headline read, Young Entrepreneur Saved from Bankruptcy by Mystery Investor. Charlotte looked closer. The entrepreneur was her grandfather. The mystery investor's name had never been published. Arthur gently touched the newspaper. Your grandfather was a good man. Charlotte whispered. You knew him before the company existed. Arthur nodded. We met when we were both 25. You were friends? Arthur smiled. More like brothers. Charlotte could barely breathe. My grandfather never told us. He promised he wouldn't. Why? Arthur slowly opened another envelope. Inside was an original partnership agreement. 2 signatures appeared at the bottom. Edward Hawthorne, Arthur Bennett. Charlotte's hands began trembling. This? Arthur nodded. Yes. I helped build Hawthorne Enterprises from the very beginning. She looked up in disbelief. You were a partner? Arthur smiled sadly. For a while. But you became a butler? That was my choice. Charlotte couldn't understand. Why would anyone give up ownership of a fortune to become a servant? Arthur's eyes filled with memories. Because your grandfather once saved my life. The room became completely silent. Every guest stopped talking. Arthur continued softly. Money can build companies, but loyalty builds families. Charlotte sat speechless. Everything she believed about Arthur, everything her family believed, was beginning to crumble. And Arthur still hadn't revealed the biggest secret of all. There was one truth about his past, a truth so shocking that it would soon force Richard Hawthorne to question everything he thought he knew about the old butler he had thrown out of his home. Charlotte sat frozen, unable to take her eyes off the faded partnership agreement. The signature was unmistakable. Her grandfather, Edward Hawthorne, and beside it, Arthur Bennett. For several long moments, no one spoke. The ticking of the antique grandfather clock echoed through the room. Finally, Charlotte whispered, "If you helped build the company, why did you become our butler?" Arthur carefully closed the leather box. Because not every debt can be repaid with money. Charlotte frowned. "I don't understand." Arthur leaned back in his chair. "Then let me tell you a story that very few people still remember." 46 years earlier, Edward Hawthorne wasn't rich. He wasn't powerful. He was a young engineer with brilliant ideas and enormous debts. Every bank had rejected him. Every investor laughed at him. His company existed only on paper. Arthur, on the other hand, came from an old family that had quietly accumulated significant wealth through shipping, railroads, and manufacturing. Unlike many wealthy heirs, hated luxury. He believed money was only valuable if it helped people build something meaningful. One rainy evening, Edward arrived at Arthur's office completely soaked. "I've been turned down everywhere." Arthur offered him a towel. "And yet you're still here." Edward smiled weakly. "I've run out of places to go." Arthur listened to Edward explain his dream for nearly 5 hours. Not once did he interrupt. When Edward finished, he looked exhausted. Arthur simply asked one question. "If I help you," Edward looked up, "will you promise to build a company that treats every employee with dignity?" Edward didn't hesitate. "I swear." Arthur smiled. "Then you have your investor." Edward stared in disbelief. "You haven't even asked how much I need." Arthur chuckled. "I've already decided." Over the next 10 years, the two men worked side by side. Arthur wasn't just an investor. He negotiated contracts, solved financial crises, introduced Edward to influential business leaders, convinced skeptical banks to extend credit. Whenever disaster struck, Arthur somehow found a solution, but he never asked for recognition. Edward often joked, "People think I'm the genius." Arthur would laugh. "Then let them." As Hawthorne Enterprises grew, journalists constantly wanted interviews. Edward always tried to include Arthur. Arthur always refused. "I don't need headlines. You deserve them. I'd rather stay behind the scenes." Eventually, reporters stopped asking. The public assumed Edward had built everything alone. Arthur never corrected them. Years later, tragedy struck. Arthur's wife, Eleanor, became seriously ill. Despite every treatment available, doctors couldn't save her. Before she passed away, she took Arthur's hand. "You've spent your whole life helping other people." Arthur smiled sadly. "I've had a good life." She gently squeezed his hand. "Promise me something." "Anything." "When I'm..." She paused. "Don't spend the rest of your life chasing money." Arthur nodded. "I promise." "Spend it protecting the people who deserve it." Those were her final words. Arthur never forgot them. Not long afterward,
Edward Hawthorne suffered a heart attack. He knew he didn't have much time left. One evening, he invited Arthur to the mansion, the very mansion Charlotte had grown up in. The two old friends sat together until sunrise. Edward looked at Arthur. "My children understand business." Arthur remained silent.
"But they don't yet understand character." Edward sighed. "I'm afraid they'll lose what truly matters." Arthur answered quietly. "Then teach them." Edward smiled sadly. "I don't think they'll listen to me." He reached into his desk and removed a sealed envelope. "If that day ever comes," he handed it to Arthur, "promise me you'll protect this family." Arthur looked at the envelope. "I already promised once. And I've never broken a promise." Edward smiled. "I know." After Edward died, everything changed. Richard took control of the company. At first, Arthur remained a silent advisor. But Richard rarely listened. He dismissed experienced employees, cut benefits, closed charitable programs, fired loyal workers to impress shareholders. Every decision focused on short-term profit. Arthur tried to guide him. Richard ignored him. Finally, Arthur made a decision. He resigned from every official position he still held. Instead, he accepted the role of butler. Charlotte stared. "You chose to become our servant?" Arthur smiled. "No. I chose to stay close enough to keep your family from destroying itself." Charlotte could barely believe what she was hearing. "You gave up power?" "I never cared about power." "You gave up wealth?" Arthur smiled again. "I already had enough." One of the businessmen sitting nearby laughed softly. "You know what's funny?" Charlotte looked at him. "Arthur could have bought Hawthorne Enterprises 3 times over 20 years ago." Charlotte blinked. "What?" The man nodded. "He never told you?" Arthur looked almost embarrassed. "There wasn't any reason." Another guest added, "Most of Arthur's investments were made quietly. He funded dozens of companies. He helped build hospitals, universities, research centers. He never wanted publicity." Charlotte looked at Arthur in complete disbelief. "So," she struggled to find the words, "you've been wealthy this entire time?" Arthur nodded. "Very." "Then why?" She looked around the modest house. "Why live here?" Arthur smiled warmly. "Because this house is big enough." One of the guests laughed. "Arthur has been saying that for 30 years. Another added, "He donated more money than most billionaires spend." Arthur waved his hand dismissively. "Enough." Just then, Arthur's phone rang. He glanced at the screen. His expression became serious. He answered. "Yes?" Silence. "I understand." He ended the call. Charlotte noticed the change in his face. "What happened?" Arthur looked toward the window. "Richard." "What about him?" "He has requested an emergency meeting." Charlotte frowned. "With you?" Arthur nodded. "He finally discovered who I am." Outside, Another luxury car pulled into the driveway. This time, it belonged to Richard Hawthorne himself. He stepped out, wearing the same expensive suit that had once made him feel untouchable. But today, his shoulders were slumped, his face was pale, and for the first time in his life, Richard Hawthorne looked like a man who had run out of answers. He slowly walked toward Arthur's front door, carrying a thick folder under one arm. Before knocking, he took a deep breath, because behind that door stood the man he had dismissed as an old butler. Only now did Richard understand that Arthur Bennett was far more than that. The fate of the Hawthorne family, and perhaps the entire company, depended on whether Arthur was willing to forgive him. Richard stood outside Arthur's front door for nearly a full minute. For the first time in decades, he felt something unfamiliar. Fear. Not fear of losing money, not fear of bankruptcy. Fear of facing a man he had deeply wronged. Finally, he knocked. Arthur opened the door almost immediately. He didn't look surprised. "Good afternoon, Richard." Richard lowered his eyes. "May I come in?" Arthur stepped aside. Of course. Charlotte watched silently as her older brother entered the modest home. The contrast struck him immediately. No marble floors, no crystal chandeliers, no priceless artwork. Yet the house felt warmer than the Hawthorne mansion had in years. Richard noticed several distinguished guests sitting in the living room. His face lost its color. He recognized every one of them. Some controlled multinational corporations. Others managed investment funds worth billions. A few had been trying to schedule meetings with him for months. Now, they were sitting comfortably in Arthur's living room, laughing over tea. One elderly businessman smiled. "Richard." Richard forced a weak smile. "Good afternoon." The businessman looked at Arthur. "So, this is the gentleman who fired you?" Arthur simply nodded. No bitterness, no sarcasm, just the truth. Richard felt smaller than ever. Arthur invited him to sit. Neither man spoke for several moments. Finally, Richard cleared his throat. "I owe you an apology." Arthur waited patiently. "I judged you." Arthur remained silent. "I thought," Richard sighed, "I thought you were just an employee." Arthur smiled gently. "I was an employee." "No," Richard shook his head. "I understand now." Arthur folded his hands. "What exactly do you understand?" Richard looked around the room. "I understand that everyone respected you, while I never even bothered to know you." Arthur's expression softened. "That's an important difference." Richard placed the thick folder on the table. "Our company is collapsing." Arthur didn't answer. "We've lost investors." Arthur nodded slightly. "I know." Richard looked surprised. "You know?" Arthur smiled. "The business world is very small." Richard swallowed. "I've come to ask for your help." Charlotte held her breath. The room became completely silent. Arthur looked directly into Richard's eyes. "Why should I help you?" Richard opened his mouth, but no words came. He realized something painful. For the first time in his life, money couldn't solve his problem. Status couldn't solve it. Power couldn't solve it. only humility could. Finally, he whispered, "Because I was wrong." Arthur remained quiet. Richard continued, "I fired the most loyal man our family ever knew. I insulted someone my father trusted. I broke every promise my grandfather made." His voice trembled. "And I am ashamed." Arthur studied him carefully. Not his suit, not his wealth, his character. After a long silence, Arthur stood. "I want to show you something." He led Richard and Charlotte into a small study. On the wall hung dozens of framed photographs. Richard slowly walked closer. There was his grandfather, Edward, smiling beside Arthur during the construction of the company's very first factory. Another photo showed Arthur holding Richard as a baby while Edward laughed beside them. Another captured Charlotte learning to ride a bicycle. Another showed Arthur standing quietly behind the family during every Christmas celebration for nearly 40 years. Richard stared in disbelief. His voice cracked. "I never noticed." Arthur smiled sadly. "You never looked." Those 4 words hit Richard harder than any accusation. Arthur opened another drawer. Inside was the sealed envelope Edward Hawthorne had given him decades earlier. The seal had never been broken. Arthur handed it to Richard. "This belongs to your family." Richard hesitated. "You never opened it?" Arthur shook his head. "It wasn't written for me." Richard carefully broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten letter. His grandfather's handwriting was unmistakable. Richard began reading aloud. "My dear family, if you are reading this, it means I am no longer with you. There is one thing I fear more than losing my fortune. I fear that my children or grandchildren may one day forget that this company was built by people, not money." Richard's hands began shaking. He continued, "Arthur Bennett is not my servant. He is my closest friend, my greatest partner, and the finest man I have ever known." Charlotte wiped tears from her eyes. Richard struggled to continue. "If you ever stop listening to Arthur, you will lose something far greater than wealth." He looked at the final lines. "Respect every person who walks through your doors, whether they wear a business suit or a servant's uniform. Character is the greatest fortune any family can possess. Protect Arthur, because for many years, he protected us." Richard lowered the letter. Tears streamed down his face. "I failed him." Arthur gently replied, "We all fail sometimes." Richard looked at Arthur. "I don't deserve forgiveness." Arthur smiled kindly. "Perhaps not." Richard nodded. "I understand. But forgiveness isn't always about deserving it." Richard looked up. "It's about giving someone the chance to become better." For several long seconds, neither man moved. Then Arthur extended his hand. Richard stared at it. Slowly, he shook it. It was the first honest handshake between them in years. Weeks passed. News spread throughout the business community. Not about scandal, about change. Richard announced sweeping reforms at Hawthorne Enterprises. Employee benefits were restored. Long-forgotten charitable foundations reopened. Retired workers received pensions that had previously been cut. Scholarship programs returned. The company established a fund to support employees facing medical emergencies. At the entrance to the company's headquarters, Richard ordered a new plaque to be installed. It didn't bear his own name. It didn't even bear Edward Hawthorne's name alone. Instead, it read, Hawthorne Enterprises was built on the friendship, integrity, and shared vision of Edward Hawthorne and Arthur Bennett. Every employee walked past those words each morning. Every visitor read them, and every executive learned the story behind them. Several months later, Arthur visited the headquarters for the first time since his dismissal. No one called him the Butler. Employees lined the lobby and applauded as he entered. Some of the oldest staff members wiped away tears. The young employees, who had never met him before, stood in respectful silence. Richard walked forward. He wasn't wearing an expensive designer watch anymore. He had changed in subtle ways. He smiled warmly. Welcome home, Arthur. Arthur looked around the building. It looks different. Richard nodded. No, he smiled. I do. Arthur couldn't help but laugh. That's true. That evening, the Hawthorne family gathered for dinner. For the first time in many years, the conversation wasn't about profits or stock prices. They talked about memories, about Edward, about kindness, about gratitude. Richard raised his glass. To the man who taught us that true wealth is measured by the lives we touch. Everyone stood. Arthur looked around the table. He realized something. Edward's promise had finally been fulfilled. The family had found its way back. Not because they became richer, but because they became better. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. If this story touched your heart, remember that every person deserves respect, regardless of their job, age, or appearance. Sometimes the quietest people carry the greatest legacy. If you enjoyed this story, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another unforgettable story. And before you go, tell us in the comments, what would you have done if you had discovered that the person you underestimated had been the one protecting your family all along? Until next time, thank you for watching. And remember, kindness is the one investment that never loses its value.